This video covers Lesson 1-7 in Secondary 1 Math, Inequalities and Interval Notation. Interval notation is a useful way of representing an answer as a range of numbers. Interval notation identifies the smallest possible solution and the largest possible solution, much like our set notation. So what we're going to do is we're going to use what we're learning about interval notation and write each expression in words as an inequality, a set notation, and interval notation. So this first one states x is greater than 3. So in inequality we have x greater than, so it's open to x, and then the 3. In set notation, we're going to use that same inequality statement, but we're going to do our brace x, the set x, such that x is greater than 3. So there's a bunch of answers here. Now, interval notation will come from this last statement above. So let's go ahead and read that last statement above here. This is done using brackets, parentheses, and here's our form that we're going to set it up in. So we're going to do x, and this e looking thing says element of, so x is an element of this set. Now we're going to use brackets if we're including the number, and we're going to use parentheses if we're going to exclude the number. So here we're greater than 3, so 3 would be the smallest possible number. So we're going to use a parenthesis because we're not including 3, comma, and our greatest value could be a billion or a trillion, but it keeps going. So we actually use this symbol, which is infinity, but we never get to infinity, so we're going to use a parenthesis to end our interval notation. Next up, x is less than 3, so x, now we're less than, so we're going to be pointing to the x, open to 3, so that's less than 3. Set notation, you probably already figured it out, the set x such that x is less than 3. And then interval notation, we're going to do it again. So we got x is an element from, now our smallest value, we can go as far negative as we want, which means we're going to go to negative infinity, all the way up to 3, but we're not including them, so we're going to use parentheses. Our third statement, x is greater than or equal to 3. That's like this. We have x is greater than, so open to x, and then we have a line underneath for equals 3. Now, this is a review. Hopefully you already have this down. Now, set notation, the set x such that x is greater than or equal to 3. Now, interval notation, x is an element. Now, 3 is the smallest since x is greater than 3, but it's included, so we're using a brace. And then our largest would be infinity, so parenthesis. Notice every time we use an infinity or negative infinity so far, we've used a parenthesis because we never can include infinity. Next up, we have x is less than or equal to 3, so x is less than or equal to 3. So we're going to use, in set notation, brace, the set x such that x is less than or equal to 3. Lastly, our interval notation, x is an element from, now the smallest value it can be is negative infinity, like the one above in red, so that's a parenthesis. The largest it can be is 3, and it includes 3, so we're going to use a brace on that side of our interval. Next up, we have all real numbers. So in all real numbers, we just state it as such. That's all real numbers. Next up, if we do it in set notation, remember all we're doing is we're putting this fancy r into braces. Okay, and lastly, for the interval, we'll still have to deal with the smallest and largest. Well, the smallest we could get, we saw on the red and green ones above, would be negative infinity. The largest we could get, we saw on the first and third ones, blue and yellow, which was positive infinity. So there's our interval notation for all real numbers. Now, no solution. we're going to have a circle with a line through it for the inequality version. For set notation in stating this, we use empty braces. For interval notation, we just use the circle with a line through it. So now we've looked at how we would write our answers as an inequality, set notation, and interval notation. Okay, so now we'll talk about how to graph an inequality. Here we have x is greater than -3. That means we're going to have an open circle. So I do all of my work above the number line. So I'm going to do an open circle at -3. The arrow is pointing right because x is greater than -3. So going to the right since it's greater than. Alright, so interval notation, we have x is an element from, and our smallest value is going to be -3, but it's not equal to -3, it's greater than that, so parenthesis, comma, and our greatest value is always infinity. Because x is greater than -3, it doesn't stop somewhere, it keeps going forever. So we say infinity. Alright, next up we have x is greater than or equal to -3. So here's where we're going to use a closed circle. And since it's still greater than, we're still going to the right with our arrow. And interval notation, x is an element from -3, but we're including -3 here because it's or equal to, and it goes on to infinity. See the subtle difference between or equal to and just a greater than. Okay, the next two we have x is less than -3. So this one we're going to use an open circle at -3, where arrow's pointing left, okay, because it is less than. Next up, interval notation for this, we're saying x is an element, and we're going to start with a parenthesis, because we're going to go to -infinity, because it goes on forever to the left, so it's all the way to -infinity. To the right, it only goes up to -3, and -3 is not included, so parenthesis. Next up, x is less than or equal to -3, so here we're going to have a closed circle, because it's the or equal to, and then we're going to have an arrow pointing to the left, because it's still the less than part. So interval notation, x is an element, and we're going to go from -infinity, since it points to the left forever, and up to -3, but it's included, so we're using a bracket. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at the last two like this that we're going to try to graph. All real numbers. How would we graph all real numbers? It means that we're including everything. You might think about just putting points everywhere, but actually if we draw a line going in both directions, it covers every value on our number line. And then in interval notation, to write this, we say x is an element from -infinity to infinity. Alright, and lastly, no solution. If there's no solution to a problem, we cannot graph it on a number line, so we just leave it blank. And the interval notation for this is that circle with a slash through it. Number one, we're going to write the solution as an inequality and in interval notation. So let's first do the inequality. We just use a variable. I'll use x. And then I notice that the arrow is pointing to the right, so it's going to be greater than. And it's an open circle, so just greater than. The value there is -20, so x is greater than -20. Interval notation, we have x as an element, and here I like to go left or right, so we're not including -20, but it is the first value, so we're going to do parenthesis, -20, comma, arrow goes on forever to the right, so we're going to infinity, and close with a parenthesis, because we can never reach infinity. Okay, number two, again, we're going to do an inequality first, so we're going to go x. Here the arrow is pointing to the left, so it's going to be a less than, and it's filled in circles, so equal to, and the value at the circle is 13, so x is less than or equal to 13. For interval notation, X is an element. We always start with this. Then left to right. So to the left, the arrow is pointing to the left, so we're going all the way to negative infinity. So using a parenthesis there, up to 13. Now we're including 13, so we're going to put a bracket on the 13. Number 3, we have X is going to be greater than, because its arrow is pointing to the right, filled in, or equal to negative 8. Our interval notation, X is an element from our smallest value, negative 8, using a bracket here because it's a filled in circle, and it goes on forever to the right, so it's going to infinity. Number 4, X is, arrow's pointing to the left, so less than, and it's an open circle, so just less than, and it's 0, so X is less than 0. Interval notation, X is an element from, now notice the arrow is pointing to the left, so we're going to start with negative infinity, and it goes up to 0 with a parenthesis since we're not including 0. Okay, for these next ones, we have the interval notation given, and we're going to write the inequality and graph it on a number line. So let's start out here with number 5. We got X is an element from negative infinity to 7. So negative infinity up to 7 means we're going to be dealing with something less than 7. So we're going to say X is less than 7. Now, notice I left space because this is an or equal to, since we have this bracket here on the 7. So it's X is less than or equal to 7. To graph this, we simply put 3 numbers on the line. So I'm always going to put what my answer is here in the middle, 7. I go 1 above, so 8. 1 below, that's 6. And then I'm going to draw my circle above the 7. I'm going to fill that in because we're including 7. And I'm going to draw the arrow to the left. Okay, number 6. X is an element from negative 5 to infinity. So here we have X. And since it's going up to positive infinity, it's going to be a greater than. It's got the bracket on the negative 5, so or equal to negative 5. Now let's pause for just a second and think about what we just did. The negative 5 was the value in our interval notation. That's what's going to be in our inequality. The infinity, positive infinity, tells us that it's going to be greater than. The bracket on the negative 5 told us the or equal to. Okay, so all of these are identifying how we're going to set up our inequality. Now let's graph it. So we got negative 5 in the middle, negative 6 is to the left, negative 4 is to the right. We're going to have a filled in circle at negative 5 and our arrow pointing to the right. Okay, so number 7, X is an element from 8 to infinity. So it looks like we got a positive infinity here, so X is going to be greater than. Since there's a parenthesis next to 8, it's just greater than. So X is greater than 8. Now to graph, we're going to have 8 to the right is 9, to the left is 7. So we're going to have a open circle at 8, arrow pointing to the right. Okay, number 8. So we have X as an element from negative infinity to negative 1. So notice both parentheses. That's a key looking at our number, negative 1. It's a parenthesis, so we're going to have a less than or greater than. Negative infinity means less than, so we have a less than negative 1. So X is less than negative 1. Then we have negative 1, 0 to the right, negative 2 to the left. We'll have an open circle at negative 1, and our arrow going to the left. This concludes our video for Lesson 1-7 of Secondary 1 Math. covering inequalities and interval notation.